Hiroshima and 9/11, collective trauma as a catalyst for citizen engagement. On August 6, 1945, at precisely 8:15 local time, an American B-29 dropped Little Boy, the world's first uranium atomic bomb, on Hiroshima, Japan, obliterating it and instantly killing an estimated 80,000 Japanese citizens. Just over 56 years later, on September 11, 2001, Islamic terrorists associated with al-Qaeda flew hijacked airliners into the World Trade Center, killing almost 3,000 people. These incidents shocked the psyches of the individuals who experienced the trauma and forced complacent societies to become accountable to victims. While the destructive scale of these two events is incomparable, examining them together reveals how, in the aftermath of a collectively experienced tragedy, resilient, impassioned citizens can shape grassroots political action and memorialization decisions. While in a moment the nuclear bomb largely destroyed Hiroshima, the bomb's long-term effect on survivors would emerge over time. The city itself was unrecognizable, with almost 90% of its buildings destroyed, trapping thousands of moaning citizens in the rubble. Black rain fell, drenching the survivors with radiation. The symptoms of radiation poisoning quickly appeared in survivors and often led to death. In the years following the bombing, long-term effects appeared in spiking rates of leukemia, cancer, and congenital disabilities. In 1954, Japanese citizens erupted in outrage after the Americans exposed a Japanese fishing boat crew to hydrogen bomb fallout after a test in the Bikini Atoll. The event triggered a Japanese anti-nuclear movement and shed new light on the suffering of Hiroshima survivors, known as hibakusha. Angry citizens pressed a reluctant government to provide relief for bombing victims and protect Japanese citizens who might suffer exposure to radiation in the future. In response, the Japanese government drafted the problematic Atomic Bomb Medical Act of 1957. While this act provided a legal definition for the hibakusha, its narrow criteria forced them to prove their legitimacy and fight for their deserved benefits. After 9/11, survivor and first responder medical concerns prompted citizens to unite behind efforts to pressure the government to respond. As in Hiroshima, thousands of Americans suffered debilitating and deadly health effects after the World Trade Center collapsed. People exposed to toxins at the site developed cancer and other illnesses at a much higher rate than the general population. Congress created a time-limited victims' compensation fund in 2001 that delivered financial relief to those most devastated. However, as the years passed, government inaction forced those sickened by the residual effects to repeatedly pressure Congress to continue benefits. Vocal citizen lobbyists finally pressured Congress to extend the fund through 2090, since the long-range exposure effects remain unknown. These events triggered civic engagement in their respective countries, yet compelled different global narratives based on citizens' access to information about them. Directly after the atomic bombings in Japan, the United States occupation force exercised broad censorship over the narrative in Japan and America, limiting access to foreign journalists, confiscating film footage and articles, and suppressing radiation illness details. The government presented a message to American citizens that was removed from human suffering and intended to retain support for the bombs. This viewpoint was problematic and untenable once the public saw images of the destruction, proof that the technology could destroy the human race. Considering American control of the narrative sheds light on the ongoing debate over whether the bombs were ethical or not. Unlike the censored images from Japan in 1945, horrifying 9/11 coverage quickly circled the globe and bombarded millions of Americans as they watched the events unfold in real time. By experiencing their shock, anger, and sadness collectively, American citizens were reminded of their shared national identity and pulled together in solidarity, patriotism, and action. As the U.S. and its allies launched retaliatory airstrikes against al-Qaeda and the Taliban in early October, Americans overwhelmingly supported the military action. In 1945, while Americans rejoiced the war's end, Japanese citizens experienced firsthand the destruction, suffering, and loss of life. As a result, the victim identity became central to the Japanese narrative following the war. The Hibakusha were not only traumatized by the bombs and resulting fires, but found themselves targets of discrimination. Many were turned away from their homes, shunned from marriage and employment, and even denied food. After American censorship ended, more Hibakusha felt motivated to record their stories, especially after successfully pressuring the Americans to release confiscated video footage in 1967. Despite their difficulties, the Hibakusha rebuilt their lives and found purpose as vocal peace movement proponents and leaders. Hibakusha were instrumental in providing emotional support for the 2011 Fukushima nuclear plant victims and were at the forefront demanding justice for them. Their message of "No more Hiroshima" morphed into "No more nuclear weapons." Protesters embraced this slogan and succeeded in pressuring the Japanese government to phase out nuclear power plants altogether. In New York City, individuals had profound reactions to the 9/11 attack and sought like-minded people with whom to shape meaning from it. In the weeks following the attack, multiple grassroots groups formed, primarily comprised of victims' family members. Despite the commonality of losing loved ones, the groups reached conflicting conclusions over whether fighting terrorism or building world peace would create the most significant legacy. Common to all groups was that members challenged politicians and other decision-makers, speaking out to achieve proper remembrance and measures of justice for those who died. Like the Hibakusha activism, many of the 9/11 group missions broadened in the years after the attack. Some, such as the Feel Good Foundation, focused initially on first responders, but now advocates for injured emergency personnel or those who face serious injury. The September 11 Families Association unites the community to support all victims of terrorism, and its tribute museum inspires visitors to honor the victims through acts of kindness. After the 9/11 Commission concluded in 2004, other groups pursued justice and pressured 4 presidents to release FBI documents suggesting a link between Saudi Arabian leadership and the attacks. Individual memories exist in a collective context, and it is in that realm stakeholders vie for meaning to assign to physical memorials. Because the world bore witness to Hiroshima's destruction, both Japanese and international stakeholders provided an impetus toward rebuilding it as a symbol of the consequences of nuclear weapons, with peace as its central narrative. The Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall remnants were near the bomb's epicenter and stood out amongst the rubble. Although preserving the structure was a contested issue, it was ultimately retained as part of Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park and Museum that opened in 1954. The dome has served as the backdrop for the annual Peace Festival since 1946. Like the remnants portion of the preserved nuclear dome, the 9/11 Museum and Memorials Foundation Hall is an underground construction, including walls that survived the initial terrorist attack and held back the Hudson River as the towers collapsed. The central focus of the hall is an enormous column, the final steel beam removed from ground zero. The physical structures, including remnants of the tragedies in both cities' memorials and museums, impart resilience narratives, showing visitors the potential of human beings to not only bounce back from destruction, but re-emerge more vigorously than ever. However, the process of developing both memorials was not without controversy, as citizens criticized their designs and exhibits. Historians decried that the Peace Park and Museum exhibits emphasize Japanese victimhood and make no corresponding mention of the context for the atomic bombs as the final act in a war due in large part to Japanese aggression. This glaring omission is problematic because it creates a dissonant and false national war memory, implying that the atrocities Japan committed during the war are not as consequential as being the only target of nuclear weapons in history. Hiroshima residents acknowledge that their city is defined by horror and grief while recognizing their dependency on that identity for tourism. Similarly, in New York, Controversy swirled around the 9/11 Memorial Museum's development as stakeholder claims to the narrative diverged. Victims' families repeatedly fought with the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation regarding plans to build commercial spaces in the footprints of the towers where workers discovered most of the human remains. The museum's mission states that honoring victims is at its heart, but the nonprofit must also create revenue streams to offset costs. Victims' families were dismayed that museum curators moved unidentified human remains to a basement repository inside the exhibit itself without their full consent. By including a gift shop, the museum proved to families of victims that it had not found an appropriate balance between commemoration and commercialism. While the degrees of devastation in Hiroshima and New York are incomparable, examining the citizens' reactions to these events highlights meaningful examples of human resilience and strength. Many citizens who collectively experienced the traumatic incidents responded by engaging in far-reaching political efforts and memorialization projects. History is cyclical, and by comparing Hiroshima and 9/11, we become connected to and inspired by the communities that banded together during times of immense tragedy. By considering these examples of citizen activism in the face of devastation, we understand that Hiroshima and 9/11 reveal the power of ordinary citizens to demand transparency, accountability, and recognition from decision makers.